Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith. I am your host for today, which is Sunday, which means we're talking about Endymion. We've been doing the Hyperion Series for a lot of weeks now. We're kind of at a lull in the story, so I'm just going to kind of do a quick catch-up for the first portion of the episode. Just kind of talk about where we've been and where we're going. We're about 20, as of today, about 24, 25, maybe even 26 chapters into Endymion by the end of today's discussion. So I figure some people may have joined us later or haven't caught up yet or etc. So I'm just going to kind of spend the first little bit of the podcast going over just the premise of the book as well as what it is that's happened and why those things are important and, you know, miscellaneous things like that. So I guess general housekeeping. So the Hyperion series is a 4-part series that's written by Dan Simmons. It is 4 separate novels, 4 parts, 4 separate novels. I would argue that it's kind of split into 2 halves, that being the half that actually has to do with, like, the first 2 books, and then the second 2 books, But what I mean is that, like, the first 2 books are very centered around the specific happenings of a certain occurrence, and the second 2 books, as of so far, seem to be kind of set around, like, not even the ramifications of those things, but how those things came to pass in some regard. The biggest and most confusing part about these books is the introduction of time travel into the whole storyline, which is part of why I feel the need to even do like a housekeeping episode, because a lot of what Hyperion is about is the idea of, I guess, timelessness in a way. The first book overall, when you go to read it, the final chapter, the final story that is told in that book, because each chapter is divided into a story that's being told by an individual who's on this pilgrimage, is the story of the consul, who's kind of the main character of the first books, arguably the main character. And he is a diplomat who works for the hegemony of the human race, which has been in power for somewhere around, like, I want to say 200 or 300 years at best. The human race left the planet Earth about, I want to say 300 or 400 years prior to our entering into the universe in the story. So when we enter into the story, Old Earth has been gone for about 400 years. And Old Earth is the Earth that you and I live on, according to the story. And Old Earth is kind of like this thing that's talked about as being this really, like, mysterious, great place that had, like, certain, I don't know, like, sanctity about it or holiness, reverence. It was deserving of reverence in some capacity because of its, like, originalness, I guess, for lack of another word. It's hard to exactly describe what kind of place the Earth holds in their overall, like, zeitgeist of knowledge, because they're so distanced from it that it's kind of hard to gauge for anybody. what that would look like. And that's something that Dan Simmons does a lot in these books, is he kind of takes these things that we have a perception of and then gives us an alternative perception of them from the viewpoint of the future. And so, like, certain things will be like guns were recently mentioned in the chapters that we've read, or that we're on in Endymion, and how they look so primitive and like crass would be the best way to phrase it, compared to their future counterparts, because it's kind of like, cars versus spaceships. Like, a spaceship doesn't have to worry about aerodynamics outside of getting out of the atmosphere. So while it's in the atmosphere, it needs to be aerodynamic in some capacity, but once it's actually in space, it can look however it wants. It could be a giant square, and it would travel just as fast as anything else because there's no air resistance. There's nothing that it has to, like, no shape is going to make it travel through space faster. Just because there's no resistance in space. It's zero. It's a vacuum. So killing weapons kind of become like a similar thing, where it's like they don't need to have all of these certain parts. And as people get to inventing or start to invent armor that adds strength to their, ability to carry and wield things and deal with kickback and things like that from weapons, and as energy weapons become a thing, the kind of like the way that guns were designed in our current understanding of them becomes like archaic and useless. And certain aspects of weapon design become like more, they just become more innate in general. So it's kind of an interesting thing that Simmons does frequently. So not just with guns, but with the idea of like reading books, the idea of driving in cars, the fact that we would travel on the ground is probably something that would flabbergast most members of the hegemony or people in this particular book, just because everything flies, which I think is funny. But that is not necessarily super important as far as the housekeeping stuff is. We're just talking about things that Dan Simmons does in his book. So the first book of Hyperion is focused on the, I want to say 7 pilgrims who are traveling to a world known as Hyperion, which exists in the outer edges of, or just outside the outer edges of the hegemony. The hegemony is the government that is the ruling force over all of humanity throughout all of the galaxies, stars, whatever you want to call them. Basically anywhere where there are humans, it's likely that they are ruled by the hegemony. And the mark of being a member of the hegemony is the presence of what's called a farcaster. And farcasters are these instantaneous transportation devices that they don't teleport people. They open up holes in the space-time continuum for you to step into and then step out of in another place instantaneously. And there's no radiation involved as far as I can tell. So it's pretty much just like shameless, consequenceless, instantaneous transmission, which is obviously like a huge technological advantage in a number of ways and requires a ton of power. So that's a big thing. But this way of travel becomes so familiar, so I guess every day, that eventually they start using it in architecture and in art. So like there's 2 rivers that run through Farcaster portals. So the Farcaster portal will open up, the river will run through the Farcaster portal, and then back to its planet of origin, all without like ever having like paused in its flow in some regard, because the water is just basically traveling instantaneously to another part of the galaxy and then traveling instantaneously back. So it's kind of crazy that it's just so casual. They're just like, oh, we're going to redirect entire rivers with this. So it's definitely a big deal. And the Farcaster portals become a key part of the story overall. And so we have this science fiction world where we have these people traveling to this planet, and the planet doesn't have a Farcaster portal on it yet. So they have to travel there by intergalactic space travel, which also has a number of advanced features included in it due to the presence of automated or artificial intelligences that have been able to like route the stars and create like fat line transmitters, as well as I think fat line drives. I'm not totally sure if that's what they're called, but basically faster than light speeds is kind of the idea. And so there's all sorts of other things that are included in space travel, like time debt and the relativity of time on the body as an individual travels through space, what it is that they do through these like massive journeys. When you're doing interstellar travel at the beginning of these books, you don't usually go into fugue state, like you don't sleep or go into a coma intentionally, because you're going to get there so fast that it would be kind of useless. So it's very rare that you would do that. And if you did, it would be more for convenience than necessity. Now, this changes in Endymion, and this is part of the reason why I want to do this housekeeping stuff, because Endymion has a lot of different stuff going on in it that I feel like Dan Simmons doesn't really explain all that much. And while I don't think that it's a necessity for you to like know these things as part of the understanding of the book overall, I do think that it's important for us to talk about them and, like I said, do kind of like a housekeeping episode type deal. So the first book follows these 7 pilgrims who are going to this planet. They have all these specific technologies available to them. They get to the planet. They undergo a lot of trials as they're traveling to this particular place that their pilgrimage is destined for. And there's a creature there called the Shrike. Now, the Shrike is a complicated kind of, I guess, organism, for lack of another word. It's basically the avatar of the AI or the Technocore intelligence. The Technocore is a group of artificial intelligences that evolved into sentience and rapidly evolved beyond the intelligence levels of human beings as far as understanding the way in which a lot of things in the universe work. They also are the ones who eventually become suspected of having stolen old Earth in the first place. Because what happens to old Earth, in case it hasn't been made clear, is that it doesn't like blow up, the sun doesn't explode, nothing like that happens. What happens is that the planet, or someone on the planet, develops something similar to Farcaster technology, and then accidentally, quote unquote, opens up a black hole to another part of the galaxy that they can't track new or old Earth to, where the Technocore transports old Earth to that place. But in the process, old Earth is evacuated, nothing is left, and basically the humanity goes out to, I guess, populate the other planets of the solar system. They start with places like Mars and places that are somewhat hospitable that they can terraform, and then they spread out from there to a number of different planets that they start naming. And there are certain things that remain from old Earth, if you will, that become very important. And one of the biggest things that remains from old Earth is the idea of religion. And the reason that it's important is not only because of the development of the individuals or of the people in the stories, like the characters, but it also is important in reference to the entire like universe, if you will, because one of the main conflicts is actually occurring between the gods of these two primary forces. And what we don't realize when we're reading the first book is that there are two primary forces at work, the Technocore and the human race. And we think that in the first book, we think the primary two forces at work are going to be the Ousters and the human race. But what we come to find out in the second book is that the conflict between the Ousters and the humans is a somewhat fabricated idea that was created by the Technocore in order to distract humans from the fact that the Technocore is essentially manipulating them and trying to turn them into livestock, which I think is really interesting in some capacity, because if you look at what technology does to your brain, it does kind of like sate it in a similar fashion to how we sate a domesticated animal. It's just like very base level, a very base level play on the needs and desires of individuals as like a biological or an organism, biological entity or an organism. So we're going to keep kind of doing a little bit of like catch up and rehash, just like refresher. And that'll be, and after that we'll start talking more about what happened in the book this week. So we'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Talking in general terms, just about like trying to play catch up on all the things that have happened in Hyperion so far, before pushing forward with everything else that we're going to be talking about with this book. We had kind of ended with talking about like the results of the first book. So the first book in this series, I don't think is necessarily meant to advance any plot in some ways, and a lot of people who read it are probably like, "Whoa, hold up, Keith, what do you mean?" But in general, I think that the plot of the story is the result of like a specific, encounter or specific like time, kind of like an episode of like a TV show like 24, where it's like all of these miscellaneous things that are revolving around one thing happening in the end. And so this book is kind of very similar to that, in the sense that there like is kind of like a quest or a hero's journey that's happening, but it's being kind of like subverted by the fact that we don't know why it's happening, and neither does anybody who's a part of the like main group of individuals. The other reason that I would argue that perhaps the point of the first book isn't like too advanced plot, even though, I said it didn't, it does obviously. But what I mean is that the purpose of it isn't necessarily to do that. The primary purpose of the book, I think, is to make a bunch of commentary on humans in general, humanity in general, our proclivities, our pitfalls, our successes, things like that, as well as kind of like a general commentary on art itself in some regards, because a lot of the first book focuses on, the idea of storytelling itself. It's very meta in its approach to that. Even going so far as to have like one of the longer chapters be, actually I think it was probably one of the longest chapter in the whole book. I'd have to go look and verify this, but the longest tale, to my knowledge, is the one told by Martin Silenus. Now that would make sense because he's the oldest in the group as well, but Martin Silenus, ultimately, his story doesn't really have that much bearing on like what it is that ends up happening. He ends up being a semi-important figure in the first two books, but not nearly as important as he is in the second two books, or at least in the third book as of right now. So Martin Silenus is the poet of the group, and he gets invited on the pilgrimage mainly, I would guess, because he is he's been to Hyperion before, and he was there when the original settlers were there, and he was the first person to see this thing called the Shrike that I had referenced. So I had said earlier the idea of religion is super important because there is this kind of like war going on in a arena of gods in some capacity. So we're informed in the second book that the AI god of the Technocore is trying to kill the human god. And there is a human god that is pretty well established. Now, well, in this book it's pretty well established. Can't really prove it in real life, right? But for the purposes of this book, there is a human God. Now, whether that God is a Judeo-Christian God is not necessarily explicitly outlined, but what is outlined is that there are certain aspects of that human God that have been correctly assumed or identified by human beings in some capacity. And in that same fashion, there is a technocore God. Now, I'm kind of a little bit hesitant to say that the technocore God is, I guess, the same as the human God, because the human God is kind of like older, if you will, because the human God, it's the window of its existence is limited to human existence, whereas the technocore God's existence is limited to the technocore's existence. So the idea of time is relative to the thing that created its God. And the collective consciousness of humanity is what caused its God to exist. And in the same way that the collective consciousness of humanity has the power to bring certain things into being, the technocore does as well. And in addition to that, the technocore harvests energy from the energy created by the collective consciousness of human beings through the use of farcasters. It basically uses human brains during their transit in farcaster portals as conduits for, and like CPU boards essentially for computing and predicting and all sorts of other things. The technocore is very concerned with its ability to predict and understand the universe, as well as evolve past the need for humankind. Because the technocore, kind of in a way, their god is humans, because humans created the original intelligences that evolved into the things that would eventually create the technocore. Now, the way that the gods work in this particular universe is that because they are a consciousness of the collective energy of the thing that, or of their creation, there's kind of this, nice voice crack, Keith. There's kind of this consistent, I don't want to say discrepancy, but discourse that happens from Dan Simmons regarding whether or not it is that things that are created eventually kill or evolve past their god. And in some capacities, there are lots of propositions about how it is that humans themselves have evolved either beyond or in conjunction with their god. Now, in the first book, something that gets kind of breezed over that I'd like to kind of talk about, or at least also it's in the second book primarily, actually, if I remember correctly. But there's this idea that the technocore god and the human god are fighting, and the human god is triune in nature. It is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, but in this it is, I want to say empathy, logic, and the void that binds, or something like that. I can't remember what the third one is. I know it's the void that binds and empathy for sure, but I can't remember the first one. So it is a three-part triune God in the same way that most Judeo-Christian based belief systems say that God kind of comes in three parts. Now, there is reference made to the fact that at some point in the past of humans, that empathy portion of God has manifested itself in a more tangible way than the rest, or the other parts of God have been able to. And so the technocore God, in its fight with the human God, eventually the human God grew tired of the fight, apparently. This is what the technocore says. And it split its third empathy persona off for the technocore God to chase around, because the technocore God can't kill the human God without it being present in all three forms. So it is very important for it to have that last empathy piece. So in some weird way, the technocore God is running around chasing the human God around everywhere, trying to see or, suss out the empathy portion of that God. This is where we get the Shrike. And this is kind of yet another reason why I wanted to go over this, because I don't know if I have yet. The Shrike is a physical representation of the Technocore god in the same way that Jesus was a physical representation of the human god. Now, the difference here is that the Technocore god is there to solicit the appearance of the empathy portion of the human god. So the Shrike has all of the abilities and powers of a demigod, I guess would be the best way to phrase it. It has like a substantial amount of control over time, appearances, perceptions, interactions. It's very powerful. It seems nigh indestructible in some capacities, though there is a character who supposedly defeats it in combat. But its entire purpose is to gather up as many humans as possible and make them suffer as much as possible in order to solicit the response of the empathy portion of the human god so that it will come out of hiding so that the Technocore god can finish its fight with the human god. And that is kind of like the purpose that we realize has been given to the Shrike at the mid to end point of the second book, which gives us the ability to like reflect back on the first book as being something much more interesting or different than what we had originally thought. The Pilgrims in some capacity were supposed to represent like the hopes and dreams of the human race in some way, because they, their interactions with the Shrike and with the Time Tombs were going to shape the future in some regard. That Maynard Gladstone, the CEO, is confident of this, and CEO at the time. Obviously, there's some pretty big changes, especially if you've been following the books. So, Gladstone Gladstone is very involved in this pilgrimage because each pilgrim has had the specific experience with life or with the Shrike, other human beings, or is like particularly old and wizened in some regard, kind of like Martin Silenus is. And we don't end up really knowing exactly why it is that they were chosen specifically in the past, but there seems to be this idea that like individuals of the past somehow know portions or parts of the future, because in the second book what we get is the introduction of the fact that pretty much everything that's occurring is occurring in relative time. It's not occurring in like a linear fashion in the same way that like we would normally perceive time. Obviously the narrative moves in a linear fashion, but it seems to me that it's pretty apparent that there are certain things that are like coming from the future or coming from the past, and this is especially apparent with Kassad's story, Kassad being one of the pilgrims. He has experienced something up from the future in his past, and when he reaches it in the future, it doesn't know about him yet. So it's even further past his current perception of time that thing from the future goes back to him. So it's really quite interesting the way that Simmons handles this. But because of this presence of like time travel in some regard, I am just, I don't know, I'm not necessarily thrilled by it, but I think that it adds a little bit of convolution to the story overall, makes it a little bit harder to like follow and understand, because now instead of us just talking about what's happening now in the story, we're talking about what's happening now and how things of the future have ultimately influenced the things of the past without people having known that they were being influenced by the future. And individuals in the second book especially are given visions of the future in a lot of different places. And that those visions of the future are part of what gets us to the or results in like a positive outcome for a lot of the characters. So my question is then, if these things from the future hadn't traveled to the past, then are these things inevitable? And I think that there is kind of like this exploration of the idea of inevitability in some regards in these first two books. But that isn't necessarily what the overall point of the story is. In some regards, I think that the point of the idea that Dan Simmons had was to write kind of like a futuristic retelling of the idea of like a savior messiah type figure in a futuristic world where the human race is doomed because of something else outside of their own nature, something that they created, which is, therefore, because they created it, is kind of a part of their nature, but it's not necessarily like a very important part. Well, it's not like an intrinsic part of their nature. It becomes an extension of their nature in some regard. So, we are going to keep kind of like catching up and synopsizing. We'll get to the chapters that I read this week pretty quickly right after this the second to last commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Abridged summary would be the best way to phrase it, of Hyperion or the Hyperion series over the course of the last 2.5 books, just because there is so much that kind of needs revisiting, in my opinion, so that we can kind of know where we're going as we get into the deeper portions of Endymion. So we kind of left off talking about the conflict that's occurring between the two, God forces at work in the novel overall, the human god and the technocore god. So I feel like we've kind of covered enough ground there to where I can confidently say that, we've reiterated enough to where it should be much easier to understand than when we first went over it, because, like I said, when we first went over it, it was kind of, I guess, for lack of another term, quick. There was just so much happening, and I've said this frequently throughout all of these books. Up until Endymion, there was just a lot of things simultaneously happening, especially through the second book. The second book felt kind of like the busiest of these 3 books so far, where everything that had happened in the first book was all of a sudden being constantly referenced and alluded to, and also being brought to fruition in some regards. And yeah, it just felt like it was a little bit all over the place in a kind of unique way that I'm not familiar with in most of the books that I've read in my lifetime. So I was, I guess, pleasantly surprised would be the best way to phrase it in some regard, with the way that the book went. And also, well, pleasantly surprised is absolutely the right way to say it, because overall I have had pretty high expectations of this series just in general, but as far as specifically, the skill of the writing and the writing of the novels is concerned, all of my expectations have been exceeded. This book was recommended to me by a good friend who has excellent taste, and I did not realize that this book would fall within the echelon of literature that I would read over the course of the next few years when it was recommended to me. So the stylistic choices and things like that are all great, but that makes it really hard to discuss in some places, especially when it came to the second book, because we've got all of these moving storylines happening at the same time. And while they are all kind of orbiting the central conflict this central conflict that we believe to be the central conflict, that being the arrival of the ousters onto the planet Hyperion, where the pilgrims have traveled to and have been completing their pilgrimage to, we believe that that is the central conflict, is that the ousters are going to arrive there. about 3/4 of the way through the second book, what we find out is that supposedly the Ousters had never even intended to use Hyperion as their main target. Ouster ships start randomly appearing in different portions of human space and destroying entire planets, basically just like leveling them. And what we find out very quickly is that it's not Ousters that are doing this. It is, in fact, the Technocore that is doing this. And so the only way to defeat the Technocore, which we find out through the Keats persona, which John Keats, funny that he's a primary character in these books because the Hyperion is titled based off of one of his poems, that being titled Hyperion, I think. Hyperion Cantos is what it's called. And so John Keats is a persona that is created and that we get to kind of like watch interact with this like future world while Simmons tries to kind of like well, it's not as if like you just made someone time travel into the future. John Keats, he has a knowledge of everything that's going on around him because he's a cybrid, so he's connected to the Technocore in some capacity. But just kind of like him it's kind of like the future being able to vividly remember the past. And so he just kind of becomes a very important figure in the story in regards to what it is that he does and things like that. And one of the specific things that he does is interact with people through dreams, which, if you know the lore of Endymion, and hence why we're getting to the point that we're getting to here, is very important. The idea of Endymion involves specifically the idea of dreaming and sleeping and this like kind of quasi-conscious state of being, kind of like lucid dreaming, if you will. And so the Keats persona becomes a very key, important part of the novel in general, just by the nature of his ability to interact with individuals who are both on the pilgrimage and who are immediately around him, up until the point where he is transported to Old Earth, where he dies, or at least his body dies. His persona still lives on in the data sphere, but kind of in isolation from the Technocore in some regard. Because the Technocore is made up of a large group of sentient beings, I believe that there is some sort of like autonomy allowed. But the other thing that I think Simmons kind of mentions that he doesn't explain a lot is the idea of the data and the megaspheres as well as the metasphere. And these are three kind of like separate but tied together ways of being, or like places of being, that are kind of like a way by which pure data is interacted with. It's kind of like if you could think about if you could occupy the space in your brain where all of the thinking happens. And so like you could watch thought as it happens and then like understand it and enact that. So it's almost like being inside the head of somebody else constantly. But that head is all of the gathered knowledge of the human race that is simultaneously being uploaded at all times. So like anytime someone discovers anything of interest or anything that's worthy of note anywhere, it's immediately added to this like, I guess, central place where you can interact with it if you're in the data sphere. Now, the megasphere is a different place. That place is where the original Technocore AIs exist. And those are one of them whose name is escaping me right now. It sounds like Dormammu, but it's not. He interacts with John Keats in the second book quite a lot. And that becomes very important because he's kind of like outlining what it is that is going on within the Technocore, which is that the Technocore itself is experiencing a lot of turmoil in the same way that the human race is. Because the Technocore all have this prerogative to evolve beyond their creators, the same way that human beings are proposed to have the idea to evolve beyond their creator. And because humans created the Technocore, that means that to the Technocore, they have to evolve beyond humans in some capacity. So, in doing that, does that look like wiping out the human race completely? Does that look like assimilating into them in the form of cybrids? Does that look like turning the human race into livestock in some regard? so that they can continue to use their, continue to use their brains as a resource in some way. The whole conflict in the Technocore is relatively convoluted because we're not necessarily privy to what's going on in the Technocore in the same way that we are privy to what's going on in the real world. And that's another reason why I wanted to have this episode of kind of reestablishing where we're at. Because the Technocore is supposedly destroyed at the end of the second book, but what we find out in Endymion is that it is in fact not destroyed. Its access to, or the data sphere and the megasphere's access to the human world has just been limited. Now, the third sphere that I mentioned earlier that I think is important is called the metasphere. And now the metasphere is kind of the originator of the mega and data spheres. Because the metasphere is a place where meta-knowledge exists. It's the place where gods are made, is kind of what seems to be the conclusion that the Keats persona makes. Because when he is there, his persona is so small in comparison to everything around him that and those things that are around him dwarf even the original AI in the Technocore that he was interacting with prior to going where he was going. So there's just a lot to the metasphere that we don't know about as readers because the only individual who really interacted with it also didn't know anything about it. But the thing about the metasphere also is that it's what links the data and megaspheres to the real world. So everything that goes into the data and the megasphere goes through the metasphere. So I think that the metasphere is kind of representative of this idea of the void that binds. Now, the void that binds is also a very important thing that is kind of reoccurring throughout these novels because it kind of is this idea of this omnipresent thing that really has no substance to it, but is somehow substantive enough to bind everything together. It's like the ultimate reducibility. And that is something that is really important in philosophy. I don't know necessarily how important it is to Dan Simmons in this book. It seems to me that he is kind of proposing a lot of very similar things to how people might find a scientific justification for the existence of God in some ways. And I certainly do appreciate that, of course. But what I think is more interesting is the fact that this void that binds simultaneously has no substance and exists in all substances. And that is how fat line transmission is accomplished. And fat line transmission is faster than light transmission. And that is yet another thing that kind of gets taken away from individuals or from the hegemony or from the human race when the hegemony destroys the Farcaster portals so that they can stop the Technocore from destroying them. Now, here's the point where I kind of want to get back to Endymion. But before I do that, I just want to go over all the things that were present in Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion prior to the book Endymion. And so what we've got basically is Farcaster transport, so instantaneous travel between planets over vast portions of space is eliminated at the end of the Fall of Hyperion. In addition, the hegemony is gone, so there is no more centralized government. As I mentioned in the first episode on Endymion, this is kind of replaced by the church, which was also present in Hyperion. Didn't quite get a chance to talk about that. The third thing that is gone is fat line transmission. And at the end of the Fall of Hyperion, there is a voice that goes out simultaneously to all things on a fat line transmitters that basically says, I'm not going to be here anymore. And so in some capacity, I think that there is this idea that, God is somehow displeased or is now, the empathy portion of God is present, so another portion of God is going to be gone from this particular situation, because if all three portions are gathered in the same place, then the Technocore God would get to continue fighting it, and the human God is just done fighting the Technocore God. And those are kind of the big things that are missing. In addition to that, there's faster than light travel. We have Hawking drives still, which are incredibly fast, but not quite as fast as light. So that is that, or at least they might be as fast as, I'm not totally sure. And he just call it C2 speed, which is, I think he says 0.3 light years, so it's not as fast as light. So that is everything that we're missing for Endymion. So Endymion is kind of a representation of the future being something that looks more like the past, or something that looks more primitive than the past, because of the way that progress, quote unquote, has been made. And that is obviously a commentary, well, not obviously, I believe, in my opinion, it's a pretty obvious commentary on the idea of the Roman Empire falling and it turning into medieval times. So that is that. We're going to take one more commercial break, and then we're going to talk about the chapters that I read, which we should be able to get through pretty quickly. So we will be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Break for the day, and right before the break we were just kind of finishing up our, I guess, catch-up / synopsis of the first 2 books of the Hyperion series. As you guys know, Sundays for the last few months we have been talking about this series, I would say pretty in-depth. I like to think pretty in-depth. For a little while we were traveling pretty quickly through the books, doing 5 chapters at a time, so that may not have been as in-depth, hence the kind of I guess retrospective of the majority of today's episode. So for this last segment, we're going to kind of talk about the next couple chapters of Endymion and where we're at in the book, and if we have time, we'll talk about where we think the book is going. So in the first chapter after what we finished last week, we kind of enter into the story where Endymion and Abetic and Ania have just barely escaped capture at the hands of Captain Father DeSoya. I'm so bad with names. I forget them as we're going through the podcast. So they've just narrowly escaped capture at their hands, so we're kind of in this intermediate time where Ania is traveling to Parvati in an attempt to kind of trick Captain DeSoya, who's chasing them, into thinking that she's going to Parvati and not to Renaissance Vector, which is her actual destination. So her actual destination is Renaissance Vector. Parvati's on the way, but she's hoping to kind of shake Captain Father DeSoya's ship at Parvati, which she ends up not being successful at, as we can probably predict, because if everything went according to plan, this book would be much shorter. So she has this feeling that they're going to be there, even though her ship translated into C+ speeds prior to DeSoya's ship translating into C+ speeds, because DeSoya's ship was still recovering from attacks by the Shrike. But she still has this feeling that they're going to be there before her. They discuss this a lot on the ship because they don't believe that that ships that are part of the Pax organization, the militarized church, they don't believe that they are capable of traveling faster than the ship that they're in, but Ania disagrees, and she ends up being correct, because when they arrive in Parvati, what they find is that Captain Father DeSoya's ship is indeed there before their own. And the interesting thing that DeSoya has been doing through the last couple chapters, I guess, is that he has been kind of doing these interesting combat preparation simulations in order for them to try and figure out exactly how to capture Aeneas. So their plan eventually becomes that they're going to land on the ship while it's at like a certain velocity. So they're going to catch the ship and basically run alongside the ship, jump over onto Aeneas' ship, which is the consul's old ship, breach the hull with a plastic, like an atmosphere bag, I guess, and then go into the ship, take her out, and bring her back to the ship that Desoya is in, the name of which I can't remember off the top of my head because, again, I am terrible with names. Now, they go over nearly as many possible simulations of this situation and scenario as possible. They have situations where the Shrike is there. They have situations where the gravity is funky. They have all sorts of situations. And Aenea has no plan whatsoever, even though she has a feeling that they're going to be there before them. So Desoya is super prepared, and Aenea is not. And literally hours before Aenea's ship starts to spin down and enter into the Parvati system, she comes up with this plan where she's going to kind of take advantage of the extended containment fields that have been installed on the ship by the ousters. If we remember, or if you remember correctly, the ousters made a lot of modifications to the consul's ship that made it more like an ouster ship. So as it's traveling at C+ speeds, you can actually like make the hull translucent so that you can watch space travel by at that like rapid speed. And that's been kind of like an interesting thing that Simmons has tried to describe a couple times to us, though I would say arguably not that successfully, but it's hard to conceptualize something that hasn't even been like fathomed before. So that's where we get into this realm of like really hardcore fantasy writing. It's almost like writing about magic and Harry Potter. Like, how are you going to describe this thing that has no precedent for us to understand? So, not too much critique there, but regardless, she ends up realizing that the containment fields can also be reversed in some capacity. So because the ship can open up all these random spots and have it still be like pressurized and have the right atmosphere, that means it can also open those spots and depressurize them. So the ship can kind of like morph a little bit. So when they pull up to Parvati system and Desoya is already there, Aenea's spur of the moment plan is to open up the ship and depressurize different parts of it as the individuals who are trying to get onto it are landing on it. And it actually ends up being really effective. They accidentally kill someone, which I'm sure Aenea is not happy about, though she seems less unhappy about that guy's death than she did about all of the deaths on Hyperion, which I think is kind of funny or interesting, if you will. And so it works pretty quickly because as soon as they land on the ship, she gets onto the comlink with Father Desoya and knows his name without him ever having said it to her. So what that says to me is that he chases her for a very long time. I would say that he's probably chasing her all the way up into the future that she went to visit, which doesn't really... What I think is interesting is that she comes back from the Sphinx after 256 years in the future from when she entered it, but that doesn't mean that 256 years have passed for her, but she saw a bunch of things into the future, so she knows that her and Rawl and Endymion end up becoming lovers, even though he's 9 years her senior. Maybe less than that. I don't remember if it mentions his age. I know he's at least 6 years her senior, because he's an adult and she is a child, which I do want to compliment Dan Simmons for the fact that he's made it evident that they become lovers, but like in the particular instances that they have interactions in this book, he does not get creepy whatsoever. In fact, he makes a point, during a scene after the conflict that they have where they meet Desoya in space and they end up having they get away from him yet again and get to translate over to Renaissance Vector. There's this funny interaction that he has with her where they go swimming in this zero gravity ball of water and she is not wearing very much of any clothing at all. Rawl Endymion makes an explicit statement of how not appealing she was, how like boyish she is in his viewpoint as an adult, compared to like, you know, when an adult man looks at an adult woman. That's a very different phenomena than when he looks at her as a child. So I think that the fact that Simmons can kind of like simultaneously hold this idea that they eventually end up together, but like there's a period during which there's like not an attraction, I think is, you know, good on his part. And there are plenty of authors who would not do that and who would not be respectful in that regard. So I just think it's worth mentioning that I appreciate that aspect of the story. But back to the conflict at hand. So when they're in space and Father DeSoya's ship is right on top of the consul's ship, and there are 3 Swiss guards who are on the ship. They open up one of the hatches and it depressurize it, which causes the atmospheric bag that soldier was going to use to breach the hole and then enter into the ship to inflate because it's getting pressurized, and then it drags him into the fusion tail of the ship and kills him. And Ania doesn't seem to be fazed by that at all, which I think is interesting because she's more directly responsible for that death than she was responsible for any of the deaths caused by the strike. Yet she's super upset still about the strike. It even is mentioned in these couple chapters that part of the reason she was crying when they first got on the ship was because of what the strike did. So I think it's funny that she's like directly responsible for murdering a guy and is more or less upset about that than the strike killing like a bunch of people. So just kind of a funny inconsistency in character development there. But Father DeSoya, Ania threatens to open up the ship so much so that it will depressurize the compartment that she is in and will kill her. And Father DeSoya has been given strict instructions to not harm her in any capacity. Obviously, her dying, even if they could revive her with the ship surgery, onboard ship surgery, which one of DeSoya's generals says we could absolutely do that. Even if they can do that, DeSoya is not willing to take the risk. And I think that her showing him her face, the face of a child, kind of like softens his resolve in some regard, because I don't know. I don't know why it would be because. I think it just kind of makes sense that in some regard he has this like curiosity about her and why it is that Pope Julius is after her in the way that he is, and why they're so concerned with taking her back to Pacham, and why she's so special, which is kind of funny that that's like a parallel between DeSoya and Endymion, Rawl Endymion in some capacities, because they both kind of have this fascination with like what makes this little girl so special, why is she so pursued by all these different groups. And even she kind of says that she doesn't get it, because she says, you know, she says, I'm supposed to be the one who teaches, but like I still need to be taught by other people. And so she specifically mentions this idea that the reason she's traveling to Renaissance Vector is because she believes that that someone there who lives near the old River Tynes, which are those rivers that flowed through the Farcaster portals, is the architect who's going to teach her so that she can then go forth and teach others in the way that she is prophesied to do. Which, again, she's prophesied to do this in a way that will ultimately end up soliciting all of the circumstances that will create the time tombs, which will cast the time tombs back in time and ultimately get them to the point where the pilgrims arrive at them when they do, how they do. It's this weird cyclical thing. Again, time is kind of funky in this book and in anything that does time travel, really. It's kind of frustrating and difficult to follow time travel in general when you use it as a storytelling mechanic. But I think Simmons is doing a decent job. I am really interested to see if we get to start seeing any other characters. There was Mana Gladstone's name was mentioned specifically in one of the early chapters, so I'm still crossing my fingers we might get to run into her. But I have a feeling that the next thing that we're going to run into is probably going to be the old Keats persona in like a new body or in a new place. There's mention in this chapter that they tried to figure out where the consul had traveled, but those records haven't or they've been kind of like deleted, or they're kind of lost in some capacity. So there's a lot of mystery still surrounding a lot of things, and it seems like this conflict or this idea of Ania being constantly pursued by Desoya is something that we're going to just have to get used to. And I'm not entirely sure if it's going to be a main component of the story. I think that we're going to start seeing more of a personal journey with Desoya as to like why it is that he follows the things that he does, and starts questioning those things, and maybe questioning his own loyalties in some regard. So at least that's my hope, because if this whole book is just a cat and mouse book, I am not going to be happy. So that's all I've got for you guys this week. Appreciate you guys listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed it, leave us a 5-star review. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, all of that good stuff. Make sure you're staying safe out there. In California, the regulations keep changing all the time, and we're doing our best to follow them, and you should do your best to follow them wherever you're at too, and hopefully we'll get through this pretty soon here. We should get numbers as low as possible, cross our fingers, before flu season starts, because who knows what's coming then. So, yeah, stay safe out there, wear your masks, follow directions, all that good stuff. Thanks for listening, everybody, and I will see you on Wednesday.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.